Hey, this is Waylon from Swiftwood Bows, and today we are going to talk about bow design. Now, I'm not going to lay out a specific design for you on a bow. I've got several other videos showing that process. I kind of want to just talk more about what goes into the thought process behind choosing a design for a particular bow. And just some of the basic principles of bow design. Um, so just to kind of define what we're talking about, what I mean by bow design is the dimensions of the bow when it's drawn out on the stave or whatever materials you're using that determines the length and the width and the taper and all of that on a bow. So whenever a bow is being designed, there's a couple important basic principles that every design is trying to achieve. And firstly, the bow needs to store energy. And in a bow, that's usually stored in all or the majority of the limbs of the bow. And so when a bow is braced and when a bow is drawn, it's storing energy. And then the other important thing that the bow needs to do is transfer that energy into the arrow. And the goal is to do that as efficiently as possible. Not all of the energy is going to be transferred into the arrow. There's no bow that has 100% efficiency. There's always some energy lost, but the goal in designing a bow is to get as close to that 100% efficiency level as you can. And I'll mention him later too. There's a gentleman named Stephen Gardner, who's one of the authors in the traditional Bowyer's Bible, who has dug a lot into the mechanics of this sort of thing. And he's talked about efficiency before, and I can't remember his exact numbers, but he talks about, the approximate percentages that well-made self bows can achieve versus other types of bows. But anyway, I won't get too far into that. What I'm getting at is that the bow needs to store energy and the bow needs to transfer energy. And then it needs to be able to do that safely so that the bow doesn't break, and it needs to be able to do it repeatedly over time without degrading the materials of the bow, breaking it down and making it perform worse in the future. And especially with natural materials, there's always going to be a little bit of degradation that happens over time. But if the bow is designed well, that can be minimized, and a bow can be shooting effectively for years and decades and even lifetimes. And that's the goal. So before we go on, I just want to talk a little bit about mass and how that plays into the design of a bow. And once again, Stephen Gardner came up with something called the mass principle, which basically tries to help quantify this idea of the importance of mass in a bow design. And he's did a lot of research and basically kind of came up with, if your bow is drawing at this draw weight, at this draw length, this should be approximately the best mass for this bow to be at. And what that means is, so for a bow to store energy, it needs to have a certain amount of mass to store that energy, a certain amount of material. And if the bow if it doesn't have enough mass, it's not going to be able to store the energy that it needs, and it may even break in its attempt to store the energy that you're asking it to store by drawing it back. So obviously we want to avoid having too little mass, but then on the flip side we can have too much mass, and that is what we call an overbuilt bow. And that means that you have this bow that has these thick or wide or whatever massive limbs, that it's too much material for the amount of energy that's being stored. And so when that bow is released, it's got to use a lot of that energy just to heave those big limbs back into position. And so a lot of that energy that would have otherwise been transferred into the arrow just ends up getting transferred back into the limbs of the bow just to move them. And then you have a slow shooting bow. It may be safe, but you can take that too far and really cut into the efficiency of your bow. So when we're thinking about laying out a bow, we need to keep that mass principle in mind and make sure that we're not either underbuilding or overbuilding our bow. And that is key to a lot of the decisions that get made in terms of length and width and taper and that sort of thing when you're building a bow. So before I go any further, I just want to kind of talk about the basic physics that our bows are contending with when we're trying to achieve these goals of storing and transferring energy. So this is a yardstick. It's even thickness, even width, all the way across. And so if we pretended it was a bow, which means that the force would get put on the ends where the string would be attached, and that got bent, I want you to think about where this is going to break, and just watch. So it breaks right about in the middle, and all things being equal, when a material is being put under this kind of strain, that's where it's going to break every time. The force gets concentrated here in the middle, and it decreases as you get out towards the ends. And so that's what we're trying to contend with when we design a bow. We want that force to get distributed out evenly along the length of the material so that it can bend safely and then spring back into shape. And so when we look at a bow, the strongest portion of the bow is always going to be in the middle, or roughly in the middle, because that's where that force is being concentrated. And then the thickness is going to taper from thick down to thin, and the width is going to taper down from wide down to narrow. And that is going to force the strain to get distributed evenly along the working lengths of the bow. And so any bow design is going to have some element of that redistribution of force through tapering. So another kind of basic physics principle that goes into the design of a bow is the difference between width and thickness when it comes to resistance to being bent. So, when I have this yardstick here, it is, probably an inch or two, probably 2 inches wide, but quite thin. Now, if we doubled the width of this yardstick so that it was, 4 inches wide instead of 2 inches, that would make it about twice as hard to bend. It would make it about twice as strong. But if we doubled the thickness of it, even though this thickness is probably like only 1/8 of an inch thick, if we made it 1/4 of an inch thick, it wouldn't be double the strength. It would be approximately 8 times the strength. And so thickness makes a huge difference in bend resistance, whereas width only makes a small amount of difference. It still makes a difference, it's a factor, but it's less so. And also something that's thicker it makes it stiffer, and it makes it more likely to break as opposed to bend. And so we have to balance these two factors of width and thickness to achieve the amount of bend that we want with the amount of force that we want to exert on it. And that kind of brings us into material. And in the case of a self bow, we're talking about wood, but this can extrapolate over to horn and sinew and all that. I mean, they're contending with the same physics. They just have different properties. But for now, I'm just going to stick mostly to wood. So I'm not going to get a whole lot into the dynamics of wood. I have other videos that talk about that. But where it pertains to bow design is that we need to take into account the strengths and weaknesses of a given wood when we're designing a bow for it. A design that works well, for something like you, where I have this narrow limb, but it's quite thick and it's rounded on the belly. This is kind of pushing the limits of that principle that I was talking about, where having something that's thick resists bending and is more likely to break or collapse. U is really strong in compression, so on the belly it's able to take that concentrated compression force and still spring back into a straight bow without taking any damage. And so by doing that, it's able to be efficient in the sense that it takes less mass to have the thickness that it needs to resist that bending than if it was wider. But if you take a wood like vine maple, for instance, if I were to build it with this design, it would take a lot of set. The fibers on the belly would get crushed, and it would retain its bend, and it would lose its performance. And so a wood like vine maple does really well when it has a wide, flat belly, and as flat of a back as you can get. This bow has a little bit of crown to it, but so you need to take into account what the wood that you're working with can do. Not all woods are created equal. So the world is full of a lot of varied bow designs. There's all kinds of amazing bows out there that are quite different from each other. And the reason for that is that all of these people who design these bows were trying to achieve those same basic principles of creating something that can store and transfer energy efficiently to the arrow. But aside from those basic physics principles that they were grappling with, they had a lot of other secondary factors that they had to deal with as well. So they had to take into account what their intended use of the bow was. Khoisan Bushman in South Africa is going to have a different intended use than a medieval English archer or a Mongolian horse archer. And so the same bow would not suit all three of their needs. So that's a big factor. What kind of draw length do I want to get? What kind of draw weight do I need to do the job that I have? Am I going to be shooting this from horseback, so it needs to be small and maneuverable? All of those questions are answered by an appropriate bow design. And so that's a huge part of that variety that exists out there. And it doesn't make one bow overall better or worse than another one. It just makes it suited for a specific job. And then another big factor that people have had to contend with over the years is where they live, what their climate's like. If you're living in the dry steppes of Mongolia, then, a sinew-backed, horn-bellied, composite bow makes a lot of sense. But if you take that same bow and you put it in the Amazon rainforest, it's going to be worthless, you know. Um, so if you go to the rainforest, you'll find these, you know, really long, you know, black palm bows that are, I don't know exactly how long they are, like 7 feet long, something that seems ridiculous, but they have to contend with this extremely wet environment that the wetter a wood gets, the the less strong in compression it is, the more prone it is to take set. And so they had to accommodate for that by making an extremely long bow, and it still served their function for the hunting that they needed to do. So we have intended use, we have, you know, their climate, and then the other major factor that everyone's had to deal with is what materials do they have available to them. You know, an Inuit person in Greenland is not going to have access to Osage orange to make a self bow. You know, they're going to have to work with either a really inferior type of bow wood, like you know, birch or something like that, or maybe even working just with animal parts. You know, so they developed this, you know, cable-backed bow, which allowed them to create a strong resistance with materials that were not really designed by themselves to make great bows. You know, and in our modern day, you know, with shipping and stuff like that, we can get access to materials that wouldn't have been in our area before. But even today, it's still a challenge for some people to get a hold of the best materials, and they just have to figure out what they can with what they've got. So I think those three factors, intended use, climate, and access to materials, really shape the wide variety of bows that we see out there. And then when you throw in just cultural tradition and influence, you get some pretty cool designs out there, but they're all still trying to solve the same basic problem. And now, you know, what do you do with all this information? I wasn't really sharing this with you necessarily so that you could put all these pieces together and come up with the perfect bow design. I don't really feel like there is a perfect bow design, you know, especially when it comes to using natural materials. There's always trade-offs, you know. There are some designs that I think are maybe slightly more efficient than others, but I think a well-made bow in any design is going to perform pretty closely to a well-made bow from another design. Certainly well enough to serve most purposes that people use bows for, like hunting and target shooting and stuff like that. You know, I think some of the flight shooting guys are really trying to get into finding the most efficient design possible to gain a few more yards distance, and it's cool to see what they're doing. But I think for most of us, getting obsessed over whether you have a recurve or a longbow or a molly or whatever is a little bit beside the point. I mean, I think you should make what you think is cool or what you feel like using, and, you know, playing around to get a little bit more efficiency can be a fun thing to explore with. But don't get caught up on some idea that there's this magic bullet, this perfect design that totally trumps all the other ones, because when it comes down to it, you know, all bows are kind of working with the same basic limitations of physics, and so play around with it, but don't get too hung up on it. And then, in terms of what you can do with this information, you know, to help your bow designing, you know, my advice is, if you're a beginning bowyer, stick with what's tried and true. Experimentation is cool, but I think that you need to have built some bows with some established, safe, reasonable designs, and then use that inquisitive mind that you have to learn what makes those designs work, what makes them safe, what makes them work for this type of wood versus that type of wood. And then you can take that knowledge and you can start tweaking it. And if you really feel like exploring, you can explore from this position of experience and knowledge. I see a lot of beginners who get all these crazy ideas. They try to smush them all together into one bow for their first bow, and they're just setting themselves up for failure. And it's not to say that some of their ideas might not be valid, but you got to take a step before you leap. So my advice is to, stick with some tried and true designs like the pyramid design or the American longbow or the American flatbow, English longbow, that sort of thing. Make sure that your design is well matched to your materials, and don't be afraid to reach out to the Bowyer community and pick their brains and get some help on designs. We're living in a time right now where we have unparalleled access to each other's information. It's never been like this before. The internet has allowed people to come together and communicate about bow making, and it's really created a renaissance for the art. And so take advantage of that. Go onto the Primitive Archer forum and say, hey, I've got this kind of wood, can you guys help me come up with a design? And they will help you. There's multiple groups on Facebook, like Primitive Bow Making, that, same thing. And a lot of the same people will be happy to help you. Feel free to contact me. I'll help you if I can. If you're one of my Patreon supporters, one of my rewards that I offer is, kind of detailed help in laying out and designing a bow when you're working on it. So consider that if you need some extra help. But in reality, I'll be willing to help anybody that asks. The Patreon is just a useful way for me to help prioritize as I get stretched more and more thin. So I hope this video was helpful. If it feels like a lot to digest, that's okay. Just kind of store it away, and use it as it makes sense. But I hope that it will help you think through your design process, and maybe recognize where you've gone wrong if something goes wrong, or why things turned out when things go right. Feel free to ask any questions that you might have, or if you have your own ideas about it, I'd love to hear them. I'm still learning all this myself. It's a never-ending process. So feel free to speak up in the comments, and I hope you found it helpful. Good luck with your projects, and take care.